we are going to bring in our guest, Stephen Stanley. He is chief economist at Pierpont Securities. He is also a Bloomberg best forecaster. He's with us now from Stamford, Connecticut. Stephen, thanks for joining us. Glad to have you on. Quick light in the manufacturing data earlier, but you're not particularly too cheered, right?
Well, I mean, the data was a little better than expected, and we can be happy about that. But certainly, in an absolute sense, the data was not great. The new orders component of the ISM was still below 50, which marks slight contraction. And that's really the key. Production increased a little bit, but if your new orders aren't growing, then eventually you're going to have to adjust downward. And so I think, what we're looking at right now is we're still growing, but very slowly, a very sluggish economy. And, more than anything else, I think a lack of confidence amongst both businesses and consumers.
And Stephen, I mean, did this data point or have any ones recently change your point of view on where you think we're going?
Well, what's been interesting about the data over the last month or two, I think, is that the various measures of confidence have been much worse than the harder measures of activity. So, we've seen for the most part, consumer spending, for example, holding up okay when consumer confidence is very weak. We've seen similar things in the manufacturing sector in terms of businesses. So I think the good news here is, again, we do still seem to be growing. There's a lot of fear of a double-dip recession, and we don't seem to be there quite yet. But the economy is not in great shape. I don't think there's any way to get around that point. Even if we are growing, we're growing at a very sluggish pace. Okay,
but I heard you say clearly you don't see a recession, at least not right now.
I don't think so, no.
So, Stephen, we're actually hosting here at Bloomberg a Republican national debate. That's on October 11th. And I'm just curious, what questions would you, as an economist, put to potential candidates about where we stand?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think one thing is we've seen certainly over the last few months with the whole debt ceiling thing that, fiscal policy has really come to the fore. And I think, one of the first things I'd ask is to get a clear sense from each candidate how they foresee that the government would get back to a more sustainable fiscal path. The path that we're on right now, obviously, is not going to work. And I think, similar to that on a parallel track, how are you going to make Washington work? I think there's a broad view out there.
So this idea of deadlock, you think, is something that any potential candidate has to answer to?
That's right, and everybody, in these presidential campaigns, everybody promises they're going to be new and different and do something that no one's ever done before, and then, once elected, it's just kind of the same old thing. So the question is, what can be done to change the way that Washington works in a way that benefits everyone? And maybe there's not an easy answer to that, but it's certainly, if you're running for president, presumably you've thought about these things a lot, and hopefully you have some possibly constructive ideas on that question.
So as an economist, basically, you want to know that both sides of the aisle can work together. Is there anything specific that you want to know, again, from the point of view of being an economist, meaning why didn't certain plans, why weren't certain details undertaken during that debt and deficit talk?
Well, again, given what the process is, we kind of know what it is. We knew that was going to go down to the last minute. I think, it just happened to be the case that this was something of a high enough profile nature that it was making the newspaper every day in the advance of it. I know lawmakers like to talk about crafting legislation as kind of the sausage factory, right? You're not really supposed to look under the hood on that one. Perhaps we as the voting public has gotten too guilty of being, too interested in the details when we should just kind of back off and let them do what they're going to do. But, I think, again, there is a lot of a substantive question here as to exactly how we're going to get back on track fiscally, whether, through spending cuts mostly, or is it going to be a lot of tax increases? Obviously, a mix of the two. We just need credible plans. I think it's easy enough to say, well, we're going to grow our way out of it, or, we can get the quick fix without doing the painful solutions. There's no easy answer here. There's nothing that can be done to get us on a more sustainable path that doesn't involve pain for at least some groups. So the question is really, how you're going to get from point A to point B, because it's going to happen. And if the politicians don't do it, the markets are going to force us into it, which we're seeing those sorts of situations in Europe right now.
We certainly are. Stephen, thanks so much for the time, for the insight. Stephen Stanley joining us there. He is chief economist at Pierpont Securities. Also, he is a Bloomberg Best.